Welcome to the MamasteFit podcast. In this episode, we're going to be talking about 2 crucial movement patterns that you need to be able to do in order to facilitate your labor progress, which is going to include internal rotation at the hip and then also a posterior pelvic tilt. Both of these movement patterns open different levels of your pelvis to make it easier for baby to enter and rotate through the pelvis. And they're typically movement patterns that are a little bit harder for us to do during pregnancy. And so emphasizing them within your prenatal workouts can really help to support your labor progress. Welcome to the MamasteFit podcast. This is Gina, perinatal fitness trainer and birth doula.
And I'm Roxanne, labor and delivery nurse and student midwife.
And this is the MamasteFit podcast, where we empower you on your prenatal fitness, birth, and postpartum return to fitness journey.
Our podcast shares how to move throughout your pregnancy to stay strong and comfortable, because pain is not a requirement of pregnancy. Understand the science of birth and how to approach recovery after birth.
We share our personal experience as mothers navigating this stage in our lives, plus our professional expertise as birth workers and fitness professionals.
Our goal is to help you feel confident as you navigate the perinatal timeframe for an empowering pregnancy, positive birth, and postpartum journey.
We are glad to have you with us on this journey and that you have chosen us to support you. So welcome to the MamasteFit podcast. In this episode, we're going to be breaking down internal rotation at the hip and then also a posterior pelvic tilt and how those 2 movements can really help to create more space in our pelvis to make it easier for your baby to enter into the pelvis and then to rotate. And these are movement patterns that we're going to incorporate into our prenatal fitness program to help prepare you for birth. And so before we get started, let's read a story from one of our athletes that got sent to us on Instagram. And so if you want to share with us your experience with our programs, we'd love to hear it. And so the message read, "The prenatal workout program had me feeling great 99% of my pregnancy, and I'm almost positive it contributed to my quick and amazing labor. I felt very confident with my movements and comfortable in my body's ability my entire pregnancy because of Gina's program," which is me. The postpartum plan was huge in ways I didn't even know I would need help, such as getting from seated on the floor to standing up with my baby in my arms as one example. After I completed that program, I was almost back to normal, and then I moved on to the return to run, which is my favorite. This program has strength, agility, and cardiovascular endurance that makes me feel like a functioning athlete again. Each program has warm-ups that are exercises I've always done with physical therapists, and they're the ones that they tell me to do when I had back plane flare-ups. I've had a history of back surgery at 25. With these programs, I've been almost completely free of back pain for 2 years, to include pregnancy and the postpartum, with no back pain flare-ups at all. Gina's fitness program, that's me again, is really a lifesaver. I definitely recommend her gym to anyone that wants to feel great and functional during pregnancy, postpartum, while getting strong and building endurance. And so it's really cool to hear your stories as you are navigating your pregnancy and your postpartum experience, especially to hear about how our fitness programs help to support you. And so if you have a story to share, please send it to us on IG. We would love to read it. And if you'd like us to support your pregnancy with prenatal fitness, we do have a few options. So we have the 40-week program, which is going to be a full version and a mini version. The full version is going to be anywhere from 45 to 75-minute long workouts, while the mini is 15 to 20 minutes. So that one's definitely built for a busier schedule. Both the programs are going to be within the Team Builder app, which is going to be presented as a list of exercises with short demo videos. And it's going to give you an option to fill in your weights and track your progress. And so it's going to be a program that you follow at your own pace and is a more traditional delivery style of programming. And the 40-week full program is the program we do here at our gym in Aberdeen, North Carolina, and the program that Roxanne and I both have done during our pregnancies, and the one that Roxanne is doing right now during her pregnancy. This program is going to sync to your current week of pregnancy. So if you're 20 weeks, you'll start at week 20 of the program. If you're 30 weeks, you'll start at week 30. And we have a one-time payment option where you get the entire program for this and all your future pregnancies, or you can just pay per month and cancel anytime. So you just grab the months that you need. But if you prefer to watch a video as you work out, we do have our on-demand programs with our fitness and our yoga. These are going to be synced to your trimester, and there's about 10 to 15 videos per trimester for you to give you some workouts to watch as you work out at the same time. If you're not sure which version you want to do, head to the show notes because we have a sample program of both, so you can check it out and learn a little bit more about which program might be the best fit for you. And then if you're like, well, I just want pelvic floor specific stuff, we do have our pelvic floor prep program that is going to help to release tension within the pelvic floor. There's tons of mobility, breathing exercises, pelvic floor relaxation exercises to help prep your pelvic floor for birth. And so you can explore all of our prenatal fitness programs and bundle them with childbirth education for 15% off at MamasteFit.com/prenatal. And again, we'll link that in the show notes. So let's talk about the pelvis and birth. And the pelvis can change shape depending on your movement pattern. And so we have our pelvis here, and there's 3 distinct levels to the pelvis. And we break this down a lot more in our childbirth education course, and we talk more about specific movements that you can do during pregnancy to prep to open each pelvic level in episode 3 of the podcast. And we also incorporate those exercises within our prenatal fitness program. But the top level of the pelvis is the inlet. This is where baby's going to first enter or engage into the pelvis. And this is going to open more with external rotation of the femurs or wide knees. It's going to help open it more side to side. And then a posterior pelvic tilt, where you're tucking your butt underneath, is going to create more space from front to back by moving the sacral promontory, which is the junction between the sacrum and the lumbar spine, backwards. And so that's going to create more space from front to back. So if I maintain more of that anterior pelvic tilt where that sacral promontory is sitting forward, it's decreasing space from front to back, and it could make it a little bit harder for baby to enter into the pelvis. And so it's really important that we can find that posterior pelvic tilt. As we move into the mid pelvis or the bony structure of the pelvis, we're thinking about asymmetrical type movement patterns. So one side is doing something different than the other. For the upper mid pelvis, we're thinking external rotation of the femur or open hip positions. This is where that hip is moving forward, and we're creating more space to allow baby to begin their rotation into the pelvis. And so if you've seen any of our tips to help rotate baby from like an OP position or posterior position where they're spine to spine, we're really emphasizing opening the upper mid pelvis to create space for baby to rotate from that OP position to more of an LOT or an OA position. The next level from the upper mid pelvis is going to be the lower mid pelvis. So this is the second half of the mid pelvis, or the bony structure that baby's hanging out in. With the lower mid pelvis, it's opposite of the upper. We're thinking internal rotation of the femur. So we're thinking closed hip positions. We're rotating the femur on top of the pelvis or vice versa. And we're creating more space here in the bottom to help baby finish their rotation underneath the pubic bone. And then we have the pelvic outlet, which is going to be internal rotation of the femurs or knees and ankles out. It's going to create more space from side to side in the bottom of the pelvis. Now, of all of those movement patterns, the ones that are pretty easy for us to do during pregnancy is going to be external rotation, so wide knees. That's the state that we live in. We live in a wide knee movement pattern. And then also more of that anterior pelvic tilt, so tucking or arching in the back, kind of poking the butt out, is where we tend to live during pregnancy. And so because of that, it's usually pretty easy to create more space in the pelvic inlet from side to side. It's usually a little bit easy to create space in the upper mid pelvis. But sometimes we have an issue where we can't find a posterior pelvic tilt, and so baby can't enter into the pelvis with ease, or they've managed to get into the pelvis, but now we have restricted space in the bottom half, and they can't finish their rotation through the mid pelvis to get underneath that pubic bone. And this is where we can see a lot of those labor stalls. So Roxanne, do you find that labor stalls can be caused due to mobility issues within the pelvis?
I'm definitely, because you can kind of feel when there is tension in the pelvic floor, and if there is certain portions of the pelvic floor that have more tension because they're not able to open that part of their pelvis due to that tension, this could lead to baby's position being like cattywampus or asynclitic. So baby could come down straight, and then due to all of that tension, cause them to like become crooked almost in the birthing canal, which could then lead to more labor stalls, like a longer labor stall. So I can definitely see like that someone who isn't able to find certain movement patterns, it being more common in labor.
And so during pregnancy, like I said, there are certain movement patterns or tendencies that are more common, which is going to be that external rotation, so wide knees, like open hip positions, and then also more of that anterior pelvic tilt or kind of arching in the back, poking that butt out. So this is where a lot of us live. And this can be a common position for someone who's like really athletic as well, because it's a power position. If I'm thinking like CrossFit where I'm throwing weight over my head, I'm thinking coming to extension and pushing the weight up. And so this is a big power position for gymnastics, for dance. Everything is very extended. And this is a very athletic position. And so typically in most fitness programs, there's going to be a big emphasis on external rotation and extension. And this tends to continue in prenatal fitness programs as well, where a lot of these programs may just omit like unsafe exercises for pregnancy, like there's no sit-ups or jumping within it. But we can also really integrate and incorporate focusing on, can we find that posterior pelvic tilt, which again is going to create more space from the front to back within the pelvis? And then can we find more of that internal rotation, which is going to open the lower half of the pelvis, which are two movement patterns that are typically more difficult to find during pregnancy due to our common postural tendencies. And so the movements that we're going to incorporate within our prenatal fitness program to help you create more space within your pelvis, particularly in these movements that are more difficult, is for a posterior pelvic tilt, we have to think about what muscles are pulling us into more of that anterior pelvic tilt, or the opposite of tucking your butt underneath. And so the muscles that are going to pull the pelvis into that anterior pelvic tilt are going to include your quad muscles, your hip flexors from the front, and then we also have our lats kind of pulling us up from the back. So if you think like you've got these two muscles here, hold this, Rex. If I got those two muscles and I'm pulling, the pelvis is going to tilt based on the way that I'm pulling. And so our skeleton positions are going to be based on how our muscles are balanced or pulling with one another. So lats are pulling, hip flexors and quads are pulling, so we're coming into more of that anterior pelvic tilt. So the first place that we can start is releasing tension in those two areas. So we can release tension in our lats, so our back musculature, and we can also release tension in like our hip flexors and our quads. And so easy movements to do that is anything where we have like a forward leaning like lat stretch, or even like the standing lat stretch. So think like big like banana type postures, and we'll overlay some videos as well for those of you that are watching the YouTube video, and we'll link some videos in the show notes for those of you that are listening to the podcast. And so one of our favorite exercises to do would be the forward leaning lat stretch. And so you're going to push your hands into a wall. You're going to come into a hinge position, and then you're going to step your feet perpendicular so that your feet are facing the 90 degrees from where your hands are pushing. And then you're going to feel this big stretch in your side body. From there, we're going to think kind of push the chest away from the floor. It's going to bring us a little bit deeper into that stretch, and you'll feel a big release through the side body and the lats. And then you can do this on the other side. And so that's one of my favorite exercises to help release tension within the lats. Do you have a similar exercise, or do you like that one?
That one is my favorite to do.
Okay, so that's the one that Roxanne would also do. Like, so number one recommendation.
What I currently do.
The other two movements that we can do are going to be focusing more on the hip flexors and the quads. And so we can do a hip flexor, like a half kneeling hip flexor release. So you're going to come into a half kneeling position. You're going to tuck your butt underneath, and then we're going to push our hips forward. So we're not thinking arch in the back. We're keeping that tucked position as we push forward. And then you can reach overhead with that same arm to add a little bit of that side body opening as well. And so this, you're going to feel this pretty much all the way through the front side of your pelvis, through the side body, up through the arm. And that's going to feel pretty nice in that plot. If you're having any like round ligament pain, in this position, you can also kind of massage your round ligament. And the way to find it is to feel your belly button and your hip bone. In the middle, you'll feel like a band, and you can gently massage that to release tension in your round ligament. Now, when it comes to the quad, we have a couch stretch, or you can just grab your foot and bring your foot to your butt, would be like a quad stretch that you can do. But I really like the couch stretch because you can put your foot on an elevated surface and then just kind of sit back into it. And same thing, we want to think kind of tuck the butt underneath. And this is going to stretch the front side of the quad to release tension in it. So Combination of doing lat releases and hip flexor and quad releases are going to help you release tension that's been pulling you into that anterior pelvic tilt so we can find more of that posterior pelvic tilt. Now, we have to remember that muscles have the ability to pull, not push. And so we want to then strengthen the muscles that can help pull my pelvis into posterior pelvic tilt, which is going to be the opposite side. So if my hip flexors and quads and my lats are pulling the pelvis anteriorly, then my glutes and hamstrings and my core are going to pull the pelvis posteriorly. And so a big group of muscles that are really important for that posterior pelvic tilt, which if we're always favoring external rotation, are going to be a little weaker, are going to be those hamstrings, and it's also going to be those adductors. So those are going to help pull the pelvis more posteriorly. It's also going to help pull the pelvis more into that internal rotation as well, because the two movements go really well together. And so we want to think about strengthening the hamstrings, such as doing deadlifts or hinge type movement patterns. If belly is getting in the way, widen the stance, or even elevating the bar onto blocks can be a good variation. You can do single leg movements or staggered stance. So the staggered stance RDL is one of our favorites to do here in the gym because we can also really incorporate a lot of that internal rotation. Doing poor man's leg curls is a great way to do a hamstring exercise. With the poor man's leg curls and more of the supine hamstring strengthening exercises, we really want to think about like driving the heel into the floor, almost like you're trying to pull it towards yourself to really feel that hamstring turn on. And that's going to really help with strengthening it a lot more as opposed to making it a solely a glute exercise. So we want to strengthen the hamstrings, strengthen the glutes, and also strengthen the adductors to help pull the pelvis from the bottom in more of that posterior pelvic tilt. Now for the top side, we have the core that we want to be thinking about, or the abdominal wall, to help kind of pull the pelvis upwards on the front for more of that posterior pelvic tilt. And so typically sit-ups and crunches and more of that abdominal flexion type movement are not optimal during pregnancy. The reason being is sometimes we don't have a great pressure management strategy when we're doing all this abdominal flexion, and we may experience coning. And what coning is when the center of the abdomen pushes out a little bit further than the rest of the abdominal wall. And this is an issue because that tissue that has thinned and stretched due to the occurrence of diastasis, which is the normal separation of the six-pack muscles, it's thinner and it's more easily manipulated by pressure. And so the more we're kind of pushing into that tissue, the more damage it potentially can be, and the harder it can heal postpartum. And it's also going to be a leak in your pressure system. And so if you get to a point where you want to lift heavier weight postpartum, or I wouldn't recommend like maxing out your lifts during pregnancy, but if you're in a postpartum point and you wanted to start maxing out weights, you may have a hard time at a certain level because you can't stabilize your core very well due to that like gap or that leak of energy. And so during pregnancy, what we do to be mindful is avoiding that coning or minimizing it as much as possible with exertion. Now, so how do we strengthen our core? Like, how am I supposed to have my core be pulled up with my core if I can't activate my core? So we can still activate our core. We can do rotational movement. We can do anti-movement. And we can also really integrate our breathing. And so when I exhale, I'm thinking pull my ribcage and pelvis closer together. So I'm inhaling into my back. And then exhale, I'm pulling my rib cage and belly, or my rib cage and pelvis closer together. And that's helped bringing me into more of that posterior pelvic tilt as well. So we can really integrate our breathing for more of that kind of abdominal flexion type movement pattern in a way that is not going to cause coning. And there are tons of other core exercises that we can do instead, such as rotational work, like diagonal banded pull downs, Pallof presses, which would be our anti-movement, like bear holds. So there's tons of core work that we can still do during pregnancy, but specific to that posterior pelvic tilt, we're thinking using our exhale to pull those 2 points closer together while also strengthening the hamstrings is going to help us find more of that rounded back position, which is going to move the sacral promontory out of the way and make it easier for baby to enter into the pelvis. And so typically when we use these 5 movements to engage baby into your pelvis, we're seeing like deep squats, like lots of external rotation. But what we really want, because external rotation is easy to find during pregnancy, is that posterior pelvic tilt. Can I tuck my butt underneath? Is there any other movements that you have found to be really helpful to find more of that posterior pelvic tilt, or are there certain points that are more challenging for you during your pregnancy?
For that posterior pelvic tilt, The movements that I find more difficult to find it is when doing like hip thrusts. I have to consciously think about doing the posterior pelvic tilts to like have obviously like the most benefit of doing those hip thrusts. But the thing that's the hardest for me is when I do it, not just like clenching in my glutes. Because then it's just like a glute really workout, not hamstring focused or getting like those other benefits. It's just like me squeezing my butt at that point. So find that that is harder for me to find when I'm thinking about trying to get the posterior pelvic tilt, is doing it in a way that I'm not just clenching in my glutes.
Yeah. And ways that we can help with that is focusing more on the hamstring activation. So either doing other exercises that emphasize the hamstring. So sometimes with hip thrusts, I like to pair a poor man's leg curl. So we have our very glute focused exercise with our hamstring focused exercise so that we're getting that activation of the hamstring. We're thinking about, I'm turning this on, I'm turning this on. And then hopefully that translates well to the hip thrust movement to help us find a little bit of that posterior pelvic tilt at the top. So it's not just all clenching and like tightening in our butt, because our butt muscles is not necessarily what is tucking the pelvis underneath. It's the hamstrings that is pulling it like under, like with a lot more power. So with the posterior pelvic tilt, this helps us find internal rotation more easily as well. So having more of that tucked butt position makes it easier for us to find internal rotation. And so internal rotation is the other really big movement pattern that's really important for prenatal fitness as we're preparing for birth. And so with internal rotation, what we're thinking is the pelvis is rotating on the femur. So if I have my femur, my pelvis is rotating on it to find a closed hip position to find that internal rotation. And what's happening is we're creating more space in the lower mid pelvis on that side that we're creating that closed hip position, which is going to make it easier for baby to finish their rotation through the pelvis. And then also when we're pushing, we can create more space in the pelvic outlet by moving the sits bones or those ischial tuberosities laterally to create more space from side to side. And so it's really important that we find internal rotation and that we have the capability to do so. Or again, like we talked about earlier, you may experience a labor stall. And so sometimes if you're in labor and you're experiencing a little bit of stall, we can focus a little bit more on specifically opening the lower mid pelvis. And so these are going to be movements like the sideline release that's really popular with spinning babies, any like hip shifted movements. And so if you follow our Instagram, we do lots of hip shifted exercises from all fours positions. You can do hip shifted with a peanut ball where you're pushing your partner's leg back, which is going to get that closed hip position. And so we can integrate some of those if we are experiencing that labor stall and baby's deep in the pelvis. It could be because there's not enough room down there. But we don't have to wait till labor to find internal rotation.
Please don't wait till labor.
We can try to find it during pregnancy. And so lots of movements that we can incorporate during our prenatal workouts to help us find that internal rotation are going to be unilaterally focused. So like one leg type movements. And if you're like, I can't do that, I have a lot of pubic pain, listen to episode 5 where we talk about managing pelvic pain, and you can join our pelvic stability programs.
Or see a pelvic floor PT.
Or see a pelvic floor physical therapist, or occupational therapist also can help with that as well.
Physiotherapist.
Anybody that is a professional that can do that. But you may find that once you start integrating internal rotation, pelvic pain also goes away, because pelvic pain can be associated with pelvic asymmetry and pelvic imbalance. So like the muscles that are supporting the pelvis are pulling unevenly with one another. And a little bit of that is due to the lack of internal rotation. And so what we want to think about with internal rotation is we are rotating that pelvis on the femur. And this is typically going to be with our unilateral focus exercises. So with our lunges, when I'm dropping to the bottom of the lunge, so let's say my left leg is forward, I'm going to rotate my right hip towards my left knee as I lower to the bottom of the lunge. So at the bottom, my belly is going to be towards my thigh. So I'm thinking weight in my big toe, knee is stacked over the ankle, and here I'm going to feel a big stretch through the hamstring and the glute at the bottom of the movement. And then as I stand up, I'm going to extend in the hip as I rotate to face forward. And then at the top of my extension, I could even rotate to open up to find more of an open hip position if I wanted to think about that full hip range of motion. So At the bottom, I'm thinking hip towards opposite knee, belly towards thigh to find that internal rotation. With that, I'm going to feel more of a stretch in the glute and hamstring. And then I'm going to exhale to face either forward or open up in my hip to feel a little bit more. So for those of you that are watching the YouTube video, we'll have an overlay that shows all of these exercises. For those of you that are watching the podcast, we'll link exercises in the show notes and then also in the transcript of this episode as well. Another movement that we can do will be the step up. This is a really popular one in our gym as well. So if I put one foot onto the box, I'm going to think the same thing. So opposite hip is going towards the forward knee. And now I'm going to put weight into that foot. Weight's in the big toe. Knee is stacked over the ankle. I'm thinking big stretch through my hamstring and my glute. And I'm going to feel that at the bottom. And then when I exhale to stand up, I'm going to face forward or I'm going to rotate to open up. So step ups are another great movement where we can feel that internal rotation. Now, one of my favorites to do that we talked about with the posterior pelvic tilt is going to be the staggered stance RDL. And with this, you can hold weight. If your belly is really getting in the way, we can also do a banded variation where you're a little bit more upright. But this is really going to integrate the hamstrings for you, which is going to be great for also that posterior pelvic tilt. So it's kind of like a 2-for-1. And so with the staggered stance, you're going to be more hinge. So we're thinking hips pushing back to the wall behind you, not to the floor below you, like with the lunge or with the squat. And so you're going to feel a lot more in the hamstring than you do with the reverse lunges. And so with this is the same thing. I'm thinking bring opposite hip towards the forward knee. I'm hinging at the hips, big toe, weight in the big toe, knee stacked over the ankle. I'm rotating in my pelvis, and then I'm going to exhale to stand up to extend in the hip. So all of these movements have the same components. I'm putting weight in my big toe, which is going to help more with that internal rotation. My knee stays stacked. I'm rotating my opposite hip towards my forward knee. And so I'm rotating the pelvis on that femur. And for some of us, we may find that internal rotation is really easy to find on one leg versus the other. And for most of us, we have asymmetry. So on the left side, we tend to favor more of an open hip position or external rotation. So that hip sits more forward, which means that the glute and the quad on the left side tend to be a little bit stronger, while the hamstring and adductor on the left side tend to be a little bit weaker. So left side likes external rotation. The right side is opposite. So we tend to favor more of a closed hip position. We tend to put weight into our right leg. So we tend to have a stronger hamstring and adductor because this leg is in more internal rotation, but we tend to have a weaker glute and quad. And so understanding that the pelvis is sitting more in this type of position where left hip is forward and right hip is back can be really helpful to understand what type of movements to do to help you find more of this position or even the opposite position as well. And so with internal rotation, we're focusing on these unilateral exercises. We're rotating the hip towards the opposite knee. So we're rotating that pelvis on that femur are going to be big things. Now, internal rotation can be really hard to find because it's not common in most fitness programs. Typically, when we do lunges, everything is facing forward. Everything is facing forward and front to back. There's not a whole lot of like rotation at the hip that is happening. And that tends to be lacking in most fitness programs. And I would definitely say probably lacking in most prenatal fitness programs as well, even though it's super important to integrate. And so if you're having a hard time feeling internal rotation, especially during pregnancy, we're always favoring external rotation. We can use some external props. So I like to use a band. I like to use foam rollers. So with the band, I'm going to place it around my knee. So my knee is resisting a pull outwards. And so now I have to work on activating my inner thighs to keep my knee stacked over my ankle. And this is going to turn on my inner thigh a little bit more and help me as I kind of move through movements. And so I like to add a band to like my lunges. I like to add them to my staggered stance RDL to really turn on my inner thigh to just bring more awareness to it. Mm-hmm. The other thing that you can do is you can add like a yoga block or a foam roller that you're pushing the knee into. So that's how we can also emphasize that inner thigh activation and that internal rotation. And now it's going to be a little bit harder to do like lunges and stuff while pushing into a foam roller that's blocking your path. But we can think like just rotating the pelvis on the femur and feeling that can be super helpful as well. Are there any movements that you like love for internal rotation for yourself that you feel the most?
For internal rotation, I'd probably say the step ups are the easiest to find initially, but the staggered stance Romanian deadlifts are my favorite. They not only make me feel like I know what the heck I'm doing and very strong, But it's easier for me to find like the activation in those ones. Um, yeah, those are probably the two for internal specific rotation.
Yeah. And so what we really like to integrate in our internal rotation movements that's also can really help with that posterior pelvic tilt is activating the posterior oblique sling. And we really like to use the crossover symmetry bands to do a lot of our banded work because they have handles. They're really good quality. We have one on every squat rack in the gym. And so we'll hold the band in the opposite hand of the working leg or the forward leg. And then at the top, when I extend my hip, I'm going to row at the same time. And this is going to activate my posterior oblique sling, which is going to help to stabilize the SI joint and also to help to stabilize the low back and can again integrate that internal rotation at the bottom by reaching, finding a little bit more length in the lats, and then more of that posterior pelvic tilt at the top when you're kind of tucking the butt underneath just a little bit at the top of your squat or your lunge. And so we really love the crossover symmetry shoulder systems and all their bands. We use them in the gym with all of our in-person clients and in our own programming. And so if you want to grab your own shoulder system, you can use code MamasteFit to get 20% off your own shoulder band system. And so other movements that we like to integrate to help find more of that posterior pelvic tilt and also internal rotation are going to be movements that we integrate into the MamasteFit birth prep circuit. I felt like everyone had their own circuit, and so I decided to just make my own based on things that I was regularly recommending. And so we have this birth prep circuit in an ebook format. We also have videos that break down each exercise as well. So you can sign up for our newsletter to get the freebie for it with all of the videos. We'll link it in our show notes and in the video description so you can grab it if you'd like, or you can find it on our website or just listen to this and I'll explain what all of them are. And so the MamasteFit birth prep circuit is integrating those two movement patterns that are hard for us to achieve, the internal rotation and the posterior pelvic tilt. And so we're releasing tension that is making it hard for us to find those positions. And then we're kind of forcing your body into those positions so that you can feel them and build awareness in those positions. So the first movement is going to be the forward leaning inversion, which is a movement that we got from spinning babies. And this is going to help to release tension in the uterine ligaments. So the uterosacral, the lower uterine ligaments, and the round ligaments. I tend to find to help more with the vertical running ligaments. And so with the forward leaning inversion, you're just going to lean forward at the hips with your knees on an elevated surface. And you should feel like a big stretch in like the low back and like the round ligament areas. And you'll hold it for about 3 breaths up to 30 seconds. And it should feel like pretty relaxing and releasing. So it's a very restorative position. It does require some shoulder strength though. So if you're unsure if it's a safe position for you, you can do like a puppy pose instead. The next few movements are going to focus on releasing that tension. So it's going to be that forward leaning lat stretch that we already talked about. It's going to include the hip flexor release. And then we're going to start to move into some movements that are going to help you find more of that internal rotation and some movement in those positions. So we're going to move into a hip shifted all fours position. So you're going to place a yoga block underneath one knee. And then you're going to shift your weight towards that knee. So we're propping the elevated hip into internal rotation. And this is also a great movement to do if you're in labor and you're trying to find more of that lower mid pelvis opening. So you can use a ball to lean on. You can use the top of the bed. This is great even if you have an epidural, if you can get into an all fours position. Just put something underneath one knee. Sometimes I'll just do like a bunch of pillows. I should start bringing a yoga block with me in my doula bag. But you can put it underneath, usually the left knee. We're going to force that into internal rotation. And then you can either just sit there or you can do what we have in the circuit, which is some pelvic tilts. So from this hip shifted position, you're just going to begin to round in the back to find more of that posterior pelvic tilt. And because we're in an asymmetrical position, it's going to help you move deeper into it because we're going to be even more posteriorly pelvic tilt as opposed to if we had a bilateral position. So we're going to find more of that rounded back position, and then you're going to drop the belly towards the floor. And now we're not going to find like our deepest expression of both of these. It's going to be like 60% or so. So I'm going to think round in my back to find that posterior pelvic tilt and then drop the belly to floor. And I'm going to keep my weight on that shifted side. And then I'm going to do the other leg as well. Typically, we want to focus more on like the left side for like the posterior pelvic tilt and internal rotation, but it is okay to do both sides as well. The final movement in the birth prep circuit is going to be this supported standing hip shift breathing drill. I'm not
Say
good at
that 10 times
naming.
fast.
I'm not good at naming my exercises. I usually just list all of the things
It's
that are
a
in it.
mouthful saying
Yeah. So I have one that's like the
exercises.
sideline hip abduction with ball squeeze and like weight or something. I'm not great at naming my exercises because then you have to teach everybody
Banded,
one of these.
sideline,
Yeah, it gets
hip
pretty silly.
abduction with
So
ball
it's
squeeze.
a supported standing hip shift and breathing drill. And so in this movement, we're going to be, again, finding more of that posterior pelvic tilt and internal rotation. I like to stand on one block with one foot. I'm going to hinge my hips back while I'm holding on to a supportive structure with the opposite hand. After I'm in that hinge position, I'm already going to feel stretching in my hamstrings and glutes, and I'm going to shift my weight to the elevated hip side. From there, I'm going to bend in the support leg. So this is bringing me into that internal rotation by, again, bringing that opposite hip towards the forward knee. From there, I'm going to push my belly away from the floor, and I'm going to find a little bit more of that posterior pelvic tilt. And then I'm going to take a huge inhale into my rib cage and my back. When you do that, if you're in this rounded position, you're going to feel the back half of your pelvic floor stretch, more so on the elevated hip side. And for a lot of us, the left posterior pelvic floor tends to be more tight compared to other parts of our pelvic floor, but the posterior half of our pelvic floor tends to be a lot tighter in general because we're favoring all of that external rotation. And so when you're doing all of your pelvic floor release exercises, we want to think more internal rotation, not just deep squats and butterfly poses. And that's like a whole nother podcast episode that I think we did with Haley. I think it's episode 9. So if you really want to dive deep into that, go listen to that episode. And so that's the last exercise of our birth prep circuit. And we do, again, have that ebook that you can sign up for our newsletter for free to get the ebook. And then you can just unsubscribe if you never want to hear from us again. But do know that we do put out some pretty good educational info for free in our newsletter.
You think we're pretty cool, so I hope you stay subscribed.
No. So just sign up for our newsletter and you'll get that freebie where it has them with pictures, it breaks down each exercise, and there's video breakdowns too, which is huge. And so the movements that I was doing during my pregnancy to prepare for my birth was all of this stuff. This was all things that I started discovering, I think during like Owen's pregnancy.
Probably.
Like 2 pregnancies ago. And so you'll notice that every time I am pregnant or postpartum, all of our programs update based on all the new things that I've been learning. And so with Sophie's pregnancy, I really updated the programs to really integrate a lot more of this type of focus with the internal rotation, helping you find that posterior pelvic tilt and also releasing tension in that posterior pelvic floor. And so I was integrating a lot of those stagger stance movements. Those are probably my favorite, the RDLs, especially with the banded rows. Really like the step. Everything became banded rows. I just really like banded rows because I have more SI joint pain during my pregnancies. And so I really managed that well by doing a lot of posterior oblique sling activation. And so those were like big things that I did. And so during my own labor, when I was like, all right, I think like my baby is in this point, I need to create a little bit more space. You can kind of sometimes sense where a baby is based on your intuitive movement patterns. I would kind of enhance those based on my own understanding of the pelvis, which was really cool to know that like that information was still somewhat accessible to me while I was in the middle of labor. But what was more cool was my body was already kind of shifting to those positions to create that space, but the space and the movement capability was there because it was something that I was working on during my pregnancy. And then in my postpartum, I just keep doing that stuff because, again, we are prepping for another pregnancy. Our fourth, I don't know what number pregnancy it would be because I did have 2 losses, but our 4th baby. And so
6 pregnancy.
Yeah, but 4th baby. I like to just call it my 4th pregnancy. And so while I am preparing for another pregnancy, I want to ensure that these movement patterns are accessible to me because they're going to be, one, helping with my pelvic pain. They're going to ensure that I stay really comfortable during my pregnancy. They're going to ensure that my glutes are stronger because I'm moving them through a larger range of motion. And it's also going to help to support my birth. And so other things that I'm doing to prep for birth, because when I did a poll, a lot of people asked that they wanted to hear about my trying to conceive prep journey. And then some people have said they really are interested in your birth prep journey. So we're going to give them all the prep. And so for me, different things that I'm doing to help prepare for birth is one, I'm ensuring that I'm taking all the different supplements that I need to be taking. And these are supplements that I decided to start taking based on my provider's recommendations, based on like blood work and things that we were doing. And so Needed is our favorite perinatal nutrition company that offers tons of supplements to support your pregnancy and your postpartum period. And so I'm taking their prenatal vitamins right now, which is something that I would recommend continuing to take throughout your childbearing years. It's a great multivitamin in general to take, especially if you are planning another pregnancy. I'm a huge fan of Needed because there's a ton of stuff in their vitamins, like more so than other companies that I found. And they also have the different types of vitamins packaged together that don't like interact or negatively impact one another, because there's certain vitamins that you're not supposed to take with one versus another, otherwise they kind of diminish the effects. And so they do a really good job of ensuring that everything that's in that prenatal is not going to counter each other, so you're not just wasting your money. I'm also taking their egg support, their COQ10. My husband is also taking the COQ10 and their whole men's line that has sperm support, omega, and a multivitamin. I'm also taking their omega. And so there's a lot of really awesome stuff that I'm taking from Needed to help support my preparation for birth journey. And if you're interested in checking out Needed, you can use code MamastePods to get 20% off your first order or first 3 months of your subscription if you decide to subscribe to them. So Needed sponsors this podcast. We love them, and we think that you will love them too if you try them out. So Roxanne, what are you doing to prep for birth with movement besides with all the things that I already told?
Pretty much everything that Gina is talking about for movement wise, I am using to prep for birth. I'm obviously doing the prenatal fitness program that Gina has created. And let's just brush her shoulder. She's so humble. But I am adding in like the work that my pelvic floor PTs have prescribed as well. So I do have like SPD pain, so symphysis pubis dysfunction with a little bit of right SI joint pain, which is very common for most people with that the tendency of having like a tighter left glute and a tighter right adductor causing this normal thing. So I've been working on one adductor strengthening based workout. So like I'll try to add in left adductor specific. So we're asymmetrical beings. It's so hard for us, I think, like as humans to only do one-sided movement. So like only doing the left adductor and not doing the right adductor is so hard for me to do. But my right adductor does not need it. It is too strong for my body. So I'm focusing on doing like specific left adductor movements and right glute movements to strengthen those two things, because that sling of my like pelvic floor is weaker than the sling of my right adductor and left glute. So those type of like strengthening, so like a Copenhagen plank, I'll just do the Copenhagen plank on my left side, and then like a Bulgarian split squat on whatever the right side, where like the right foot is elevated. No,
The right foot is down.
the right foot is down. See, I have to think about it every time. But then doing that left hip shifted movements to find the lengthening that I need as well, because like my right side is tight, but it's not very lengthened on my adductor. So doing more lengthening again on that opposite sling of my left glute and my right adductor. So those are like added things that I've been adding in. And I found like throughout my life, like internal rotation just in general is pretty hard to find. Like I did yoga for many years, and hero's pose was never my forte. Hero's pose, warrior one, literally every internal rotation pose, not my favorite. And so it was harder to figure out that I needed to do internal rotation. It probably would have contributed to maybe quicker labors with my first. But you only know what you know at the time. So this time, third time's the charm, right? Gonna focus more on all of these things to hopefully have a easier birth.
And so big movements that we want to be incorporating to support opening the pelvis to make it easier for a baby to enter and navigate through the pelvis are going to include that posterior pelvic tilt or tucking the butt underneath. So this is going to move that sacropromontory backwards to create more space from front to back. And so this is going to make it easier for baby to enter or engage into the pelvis. The next thing that we want to focus on is that internal rotation, either bilaterally with both legs to open the pelvic outlet or unilaterally to open just the lower mid pelvis. And so internal rotation, think like closed hip positions, bringing knee towards midline, rotating the pelvis on the femur towards that femur would be a closed hip position. And this is going to create more space in the lower half of the pelvis to help baby finish their rotation through the pelvis. A posterior pelvic tilt also can sometimes make it easier to find internal rotation. So those two movements are really integrated together. The ways that we can achieve more of that posterior pelvic tilt is going to be to release tension in the tight sides, which is probably going to be your hip flexors and quads and your lats, while strengthening the lengthened sides, which is going to be your hamstrings, which is going to be huge for Roxanne, and then also your glutes plus your core. And so we can work on the core by doing rotational work like diagonal pull downs or upward chops, but we can also really focus on that exhale, pulling the rib cage and pelvis closer together is going to help bring us into more of a tucked position as well. When it comes to internal rotation, we're thinking rotating that pelvis on the femur, and we can do this more with those unilateral or single leg type movements. So our lunges, our step ups, our staggered stance RDLs are going to be huge movements that we can do that we integrate within our prenatal fitness program, plus a lot more. So we're including a lot of exercises to help kind of release that uneven tension, and a lot of strengthening exercises to help you pull into those positions, because we don't want to wait till labor to realize that we have a hard time finding specific movements in our pelvis and then experience a stall. I would rather you be navigating your labor with all this movement accessible to you so that if you do experience a stall, it's easy for you to shift your position to create more of that space. And so we would love to support you with our prenatal fitness programs. We would love to educate you more on pelvic mechanics and how it opens and how your baby is navigating through it with our childbirth education courses. We would love to support you postpartum with our postpartum fitness courses and our pelvic floor prep courses, which is integrated with them. If you're a professional, we have our birth workers course and our fitness professionals course if you want to earn CEUs and learn from our expertise of working exclusively with the perinatal population. So thank you for listening to this episode.
Please subscribe to our channel, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, whatever channel or platform you are listening to us on. Please subscribe. Leave a review if you loved this. It helps us out so much. We release new episodes every Wednesday, and then we release birth stories every Friday. Our podcast is sponsored by Needed, a perinatal nutrition company that we love. We both take all of their supplements. I think together we take every single one of their supplements, and you can use code MamasteFit for 20% off your first order.
It's MamastePod for 20%.
Sorry, MamastePod. Always forget it. And that's 20% off your first order or the first 3 months of a subscription. And then our other sponsor is Crossover Symmetry, the shoulder system that just gives you shoulders of steel and helps just strengthen
bulletproof shoulders.
I think that's their actual slogans, bulletproof shoulders. But my husband uses them. We use them. We have them in our home gyms and every single rack in our gym here in Aberdeen. Use code MamasteFit for that one for 20% off your own shoulder system.
So thanks for listening. We'll catch you next week.